I'm Ambola Mame. I'm from the Krishna Full Fellowship and American University. I'm studying development with a concentration in agricultural development. So my question has to do with the linkages of trade. How does trade impact the growth of agriculture? Or how does trade impact agricultural potential to addressing poverty in countries in sub-Saharan Africa?
Okay, so what I suggest we do is we collect two or three, or maybe 4 or 5 questions, and then give the presenters an opportunity to respond. So, this gentleman here.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Said with the Tony Blair Institute. Just picking up on a point that you mentioned, Rob, about the looking at these sort of the indirect ways of that agriculture can help with poverty reduction. I wanted to ask the panel, also yourself, Luke, if you've seen analysis or enough analysis on the linkage between particularly agro-processing, not just of food ag crops, but also of non-food ag crops as well, and how that can link back to poverty reduction metrics as well, and whether that's an area that needs more exploration or not.
Thank you. There was a hand over there.
I'm Nick Minot from IFPRI. I was wondering, in these estimates of the elasticity of growth in different sectors, how that affects the elasticity of poverty reduction with respect to growth in different sectors. Does that means that the size of the sector is going to have an effect on the overall absolute increase in GDP caused by 1% growth? And I'm wondering, does that help explain why the poverty-reducing effect of agriculture tapers off in high-income countries, just because the agricultural sector is getting smaller, or are there other reasons?
Thanks. I'm trying to remember the order of points, but sorry, Derek Heddy here in IFPRI. Points 6 and 7. So we want agriculture to be able to shed labor at little cost. In Bangladesh, agricultural output hires more family labor. Are those contradictory or complementary? I'm trying to work it out. So if you could comment on that, that'd be great.
Thank you. We haven't got anybody remotely sending questions in, I don't think, as far as I can see. So before I pass that to the panel, I actually have a couple of questions of my own, or comments that I'll abuse my position in the chair to ask you. It was interesting that the analysis pays attention to which non-ag sectors are growing and the difference that makes. I just wondered whether you'd also looked at which bits of agriculture are growing, because in the old paradigm, based on thinking about grain production and intensifying the machinery in grain and shedding a lot of labour, that's the old paradigm. But when one looks at how agriculture is evolving in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia at the moment, the opportunity for much more labour-intensive, high-value added crops, in aromatics and in what we used to call market gardening, I suppose, might open up an opportunity for a much higher sustainable level of relatively productive labour in farming in the future, and so that the future isn't that all of the labour disappears and we just have combine harvesters, but that the equilibrium level of employment in agriculture might be a lot higher. That was one comment that I had. The other comment that I had was that when we think about sectors, we have a notion of the mean productivity within a sector, but of course there are distributions in the sectors. And in the jobs diagnostics work that we've been doing in the bank, looking at these issues, the same issues that the Macmillan paper is looking at, we see that it makes a big difference, not just whether labour is moving into services, but which bit of the services sector it's moving into. Is it moving into marginal markets with very low productivity, which may be somewhat higher than the almost zero marginal productivity that these people had in the farms, but is low and doesn't have much potential to grow? Or is it moving into higher productivity services sectors, possibly in the formal sector? I was very surprised to see that in Mozambique, the flow of labour into formal services over the last decade was as big as the flow of labour into informal services. It was almost 50-50. And it seems to me that those differences within sectors matter, and that it would be great if the analysis could look at that. And to some extent, it has to do with the type of market linkages and the degree of formality.
I'll start with the easy questions and leave all the hard ones to Luke. Robert, your question about farm profits, I'm reasonably pessimistic. If we think of a productivity gain that lowers costs by 1%, and we have, or increases output with the same resource input by 1%, we then have a reduction in the price that's determined by the elasticity of demand, and if that's low, the gross revenue is likely to fall. As well as that, if prices are the same, there's another output effect going on here. Because it's more profitable at constant prices, you get a second round increase in output. So that comes into play as well. So there's and that reduces costs less. That's a triangle of gains, whereas the first impact, the direct productivity impact's a rectangle of gain. So I am kind of pessimistic about the impact of productivity on farm profits. We then, though, just have to be very careful and take into account the impact of that on consumers, including the farmers. And those poor farmers tend to be consuming most, if not all, or more than of their production, and that's where those results come from. I think the Cochrane's treadmill point is also very important. One of the things we haven't done is to allow for some producers not to adopt the technology, and that may be an important element of the problem you raise in Ghana. The linkages between ag processing and poverty. I mean, if you get lower processing costs, you're going to have a higher price to the producer, a lower cost to the consumer, or some combination thereof. So the potential for gains there is very, very large. I think another potential gain from lowering production, processing and transport costs is that a lot of important, interesting, innovative value chains of the type Ian was talking about don't actually exist in the initial situation where you have high processing costs or a terrible investment climate for those activities. So if you can get processing and transport costs down, you're going to get new value chains which are potentially very, very important. And then just the final easy question I'll touch on is Nick Minot's question. Here we've tended to focus on the cases where there's a 1% increase in GDP in each case, agriculture, manufacturing, services. That's the tradition in this literature, and it's a very interesting experiment because it says it abstracts from the changes in those shares within sectors. We also report results, though, for a 1% increase in output in each sector. And that, in that case, that's another reason why the impact of agricultural growth declines, but as incomes rise. But it's there even when we standardise the productivity shock to be 1% of GDP.
Thank you. Maybe following on to Will's point. Yeah, I think on why it is that the effect may come down. A lot of the benefits from agricultural productivity growth, even if you take a 1 percentage point GDP growth, or you equalize them across sectors, is of the second round effects. And of course, if less people are involved in agriculture, then the second round effects are going to be smaller. And so it's what Rob referred to, the buying of the non-tradable goods and services. Why is staple crop productivity growth so powerful? Because it affects many people, it affects them locally, and thus it may result in the increased demand for locally produced goods and services, and doesn't exit out of agriculture into these off-farm sectors. And that will become smaller if less people are involved. And why are less people involved? Because a larger, it's Engel's law, because a larger share of the total spending, or there's a declining share of the total spending spent on agriculture. So then the opposite of that is a larger share spent on other goods. So somebody has to produce them. So that's the off-farm sector. So I think that's where it starts. So I think at the end of the day, and now I don't think Ghana is at that stage yet, so I wouldn't go that far. And mind you, when we say the advantage declines, doesn't mean there is no role to be played. It means that agriculture becomes a business like any other business. And so I think you were on your graph, Will, I think you're at 3,000 GDP per capita, $3,000. So, and even then then it starts to converge, at least if you take trend lines. So the richer the countries get, the more agriculture becomes like any other business. That means there's still a role for agriculture. It's just not the sort of kick-starting the poverty-reducing process. And that's an important nuance. And I think a lot of the debates we often have is people in their mind, they compare Latin America with Asia much further down the line with a country at $700 per capita. It all goes into one pot. And I think that's sort of often confusing. So I think that, but it is important to acknowledge that. On the agro-processing, I think basically for some sectors, I think supplying the cities these days, and rice is an excellent example, to supply the urban demand for rice and be competitive with international rice, imported rice, one needs to have some standards, one needs to have some assured volume of a certain consistency. And having mills, having rice mills, which can deliver a certain amount of a certain quality without stones to begin with, helps. That is sort of important. And in order to set that up, you need to tackle simultaneous constraints at once. So it's not just even tackling the agro-processing side. No, because then the agro-processor is there, but then there is no rice. So because the farmer doesn't have credit to buy the inputs, or they don't have the right seeds. So that's why the whole value chain approach comes into play, where the agro-processing is an important part of that. But again, it's not the only part, and that's sort of the whole value chain approach. So I think, yes, agro-processing is important as part of a broader package. I think, Rob, you raised a very important question about the direct and indirect effects. And in my mind, and I'm talking Africa, we're about 1.5 ton per hectare in cereal yields. When China started the household responsibility system, they're already at 2.7. When Vietnam started the Doi Moi, they were around at 2.7. They got a big jump from institutional reforms. They were in a very peculiar situation. But the point I'm trying to make is that we're still at very low levels of staple crop productivity. Now, staple crop product, just producing the amount of staples still requires way too much labor just to meet that at the technologies we are at. And David Charlie has done some very interesting, sort of very rough calculations, say, look, let's forecast the demand as we observe it with income elasticities, as we observe it in the household survey for Tanzania. And you see that most of the labor will be needed, so you could say this employment will be needed in producing these staple crops. So staple crop productivity remains a very important agenda today. I don't see how you can radically absorb, like release that labor in a productive way unless you do that. Now, that then brings us sort of to what are direct and indirect effects. A lot of the public goods, getting farmers to increase by 0.5 ton, what Ethiopia has done, or double, actually Ethiopia has more than doubled its yields over the past 15 years. I think there is an agenda where many people can still benefit directly because many farmers are producing for their own consumption. And sort of bringing that up is one important point. Now, when it comes, and I think that's Ian's point, all the other sectors, and I agree with you, Ian, actually in the poverty report we're doing for Africa, we do split up this agriculture sector quite in staples and non-staples, exported, etc. So, and I think it's very important. So the staple crop productivity growth is an important agenda which I think can have wide poverty reducing effect through the producer side. Even if you're a net buyer, if you need to buy less because you produce more, you can still have to buy, but then you still need to, so your incomes go up. On the other side, whether that all have to be the poorest farmers in the village is a totally different ballgame, I think. I'm not convinced that that is the case, and I think what Mellor put forward so many decades ago, the notion of the slightly more innovative, larger farmer. I'm not talking about the large farmer. I'm talking about the top quintile in your village, or the top tercile in your village, those who are in farm. And there, a lot of the benefits will come from the indirect effects, either through the labor market or through the generation of farm employment. And again, some very interesting preliminary results coming out of the work by Tom Jane and Jordan Chamberlain, where basically they look in Tanzania, and there you have they look at the medium-sized farms, going from 5 hectares to 100 hectares. And what they find is that in districts where there are a larger share of medium-sized farms, a larger share of the land is cultivated by the medium-sized farmers. What does that do for different sources of income? Does it increase for the people, other farmers in the district? And it's sort of interesting, above 10 hectares, the largest share of the land cultivated by farms above 10 hectares, so you split up this group of 5 to 100 hectares, you split it up. If the farmer gets a bit larger, then basically you even get negative effects on the incomes of the other labor or the other households. Below that, you actually get positive effects, and most of it comes through off-farm employment, so indirect effects. So here you have a group of farmers which are a bit more dynamic, a bit larger, they can apply some mechanization, etc., adopt some new technologies, but the others benefit to a sizable extent. It's not only that, they get a bit better prices, sometimes their agricultural income goes up as well, but the off-farm income is an important element of that. So that's sort of on the indirect side. Let me stop there, otherwise I think.
Thank you, Ian. I'm really glad that Luke just emphasized the importance of staple productivity. I talk a lot these days about the opportunities for diversification that I mentioned here today. It's not an either or, it's both and. And staple productivity growth, in many cases, it's either directly or indirectly going to be a potentiating factor towards freeing up land that can be put into fruits and vegetables and animal source foods and forages and so forth. My colleague Jerry Glover, who leads our sustainable intensification work, just building on your point about where Africa is, the 1.5 tons, and a lot of places we're working, it's 1 ton still, that we can talk about things like credit and index insurance and all these things, but if you're at that low a level, people just aren't able to go there. It's basically basic agronomy that's needed, really sort of fundamental improvements that then, as people become more savvy about access to markets and things that reduce their risks and such, open up new opportunities. Also, I didn't say this in my comments, but it's come out again, and I think it's in the point about landlocked countries, is this issue that we see the benefits in both tradables and non-tradables. That's a very important finding. In other words, that we can get benefits from gains in the staples like rice. And we do have an example in Senegal where we were able to make real gains, and it's exactly what you said, Luke. It was better genetics, better infrastructure and storage, better mills that didn't break the rice, finance coming in, but at the end of the day, they were able to compete with Asian rice in Dakar. So that's a significant achievement. Finally, we haven't talked about resilience, which is a big issue for us right now, and that is trying to invest in ways that reduce future needs for humanitarian assistance. So it pulls us the direction of more at-risk, vulnerable environments, sometimes bordering on conflict environments. And just a key point on that I think is relevant and salient for all of our work is that just the presence of markets alone, and that's where this infrastructure comment is so critical as well, but just the presence of markets alone confers a significant additional resilience to systems because it buffers shocks, and people are not as isolated and as disconnected, and maybe they have a few more options in terms of how to use their land, labor, and capital. Thank you.
We have 5 more minutes. I can see one question here, a question here, and also a question coming in from somebody online. Let's take the question from the person online first, and then these 2 questions.
Thank you. I'm reading for Antonio from Guatemala. His question is, do you compare the effect of remittances versus agriculture in poverty reduction? Remittances are relevant in Central America. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, Xin Diao from IFPRI. And for your presentation, actually, you have a first part of the title is agriculture transformation. Indeed, we all know the importance of poverty reduction agriculture. My question is related to the transformation in terms of incentive, because will you answer to Bob's question, you say the profit is unlikely to rise with the productivity. The question becomes, why I'm a commercial agriculture farmer, right? Why I'm not going to do small business in non-agriculture. So that also related to the debate Peter Heisel, others raised this typology of farmers, right? So once you move out of subsistence agriculture, right now we all know this subsistence agriculture, for sure poverty reduction is very high. But how about those already a little bit better off farmers? We are pushing them to become commercial agriculture, but now we told them, actually your profit will be falling. So that's my question.
Hello, my name is Saskia from Partners of the Americas. So this is in regard to the second point about poverty reducing advantage. And you kind of mentioned it too about kickstarting poverty reduction. Is the goal then to have short-term programs for 5 to 10 years or maybe 25 years for farmers and then encourage them to go into another sector? So kind of like your point, if they're not going to really make any money as commercial farmers in the long run, do we push them to go into another sector in the future and train people to other sectors? Or do we continue to have these countries focus on agriculture even if the poverty reducing advantage is going to reduce?
Okay, thanks very much. There are exactly 3 minutes, so you're going to get a minute each. There are really two questions. One, how important are remittances in these stories? Was that picked up at all in the study? Then the other is it really feasible to have profitable farming in the medium term? That's how I would kind of summarize the question, given the interplay of productivity growth and prices.
Thank you, Ian. Great questions, thank you. Xinchen, yeah, there will be profitable farmers. There'll just be a smaller and smaller share. This country once had 75% of its workforce in agriculture. It's now maybe 2%. That's how people will manage to make a living, and then they'll be free to move to other areas. Derek, you raised a question we didn't address earlier. We've got the Schulpe paper gets an increase in total labour supply by farm households. That's coming out of less productive home activities like foraging. That's in addition. That's an additional gain to the one that you get through structural transformation. The point that Volrath emphasised, so commercial farmers will be successful. Yep.
Maybe following up on Derek's question. First of all, this is not a general equilibrium study. This is a micro study. So by definition, you're not going to get general equilibrium effects over time, etc., when everything is said and done and settled in the new equilibrium, and then you'll have less labor. The notion that there will be fewer people in agriculture is just, at the end of the day, is a simple reflection of what we like to consume. right? If Engel's law tells us that we're going to have more money. Engel's law doesn't tell us that, but when we have more money, we're going to spend a larger share on non-agricultural goods. We get a little bit of Bennett coming in with diversification and some value addition, etc. But the bottom line is we spend less on food. So as a result, somebody in the hall has to produce these other goods. So we will hopefully need less people. Now, the key point in all of this is this dynamic, this simple dynamic, is that in order to be able to do that, we need to also get better at producing food. We need to get more productive. So you want to get more productive to get out of agriculture. And then you end up in a bit of tension. Now, this tension is not any way different than what we're experiencing with technology today. The computer you had so many years ago and the computer you have today is very different. So technology has improved. Less people are probably in computer production, etc. So this is a simple dynamic, and there is friction in this whole process. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Luke. Rob?
Yes, just to add a little bit more on the non-staple issues. As I said, I think that it's very clear that growing incomes in cities and towns is going to drive demand for fruits and vegetables and nuts and animal source foods and a lot of things that are knowledge intensive but also highly profitable. I think because of their value and the importance of both value preservation and post-harvest loss reduction and value addition potentially, those are going to be employment rich. They're going to be more attractive to youth. You know, we talk a lot about youth these days. These value chains are going to be much more about transport and making markets work efficiently and handling product well. So I'm very bullish on that. Hopefully, Doug, that's going to translate into more affordable, quality food choices for the poor in both urban and rural areas so that we can improve the diets and start to get the kind of impacts on nutrition long term that we're seeking. Finally, I think it's very intriguing, Luke's point about the 10-hectare farm that Tom Jane and others are finding. Why is that? Why is going above 10 hectares less likely to spill over? Understanding that could be really interesting in terms of the where that money is being spent. Is it going, a lot of that income above 10 hectares is coming from the city. It's money coming back into those systems. Tom has told me this. Maybe at 10 hectares and below, you're at a sweet spot where some amount of that money just doesn't go to import televisions, but also goes for all kinds of locally produced goods and services.
Okay, thank you very much. Just remains for me to thank everybody for coming. Thank very much Luke and Will and Rob for their presentations and comments. I hope you all take time to read the whole publication and enjoy it as I certainly intend to do. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.